Hello and welcome to this special episode of Wait Just an Infosec. Thanks, Stephen, for setting this up, and thanks, Bojan, for joining me here. We'll be talking a little bit about the xz-utils backdoor, in particular, some of the work that Bojan has done in reverse engineering it. I think one of the big lessons that I want to get across here is this is probably not the last time you're going to see something like this. It's very unlikely that you were affected by this particular event. However, who knows about the next similar event? And I hope some of the reverse analysis that Bojan is showing you here, and I'll talk a little bit about the social aspects of it later, will get you ready for this next event, which is probably going to come. Or Bojan, what do you think about it? Why don't you take it away here?
Cool. So thanks, Johannes, for the introduction. Well, indeed, this is not the last time probably we see something like this, but I think it's kind of the first time that we see something of this magnitude. And as I wrote in that blog post earlier, it's, I think, both amazing and incredibly scary. So let me go to some of the things that I found out over the weekend in next probably 10 minutes. So hopefully it'll be interesting for everyone. So first, like a really short recap here. So on Friday last week, there was an interesting post by Freund on the open wall mailing list about his discovery of a backdoor in the SSHD service. And this is by itself really fascinating how he actually identified that something weird is going on with his installation of SSH service. He actually saw that the SSHD service is using unusually large amount of CPU time, and this was causing some delays as well, and that kind of prompted him into investigating further on what's going on over there, and he ended up finding a backdoor. So now, not the first time that we can see a backdoor, but the whole story behind this one is really interesting. And I think you'll, as I said, you'll cover some social engineering aspects around this. So of course, when I saw this on Friday and I thought, hey, what better way to spend the long weekend than reversing some malware? But at the end of the day, it turned out that this is actually quite interesting, both from a reversing point of view and as well by looking at some of the design decisions that they decided to do here. So what post on the open wall mailing list contained on Friday was also the backdoor itself, which was very cleverly disguised as part of the xz-utils package, which actually contains, again, a library for a very specific compression format that is being used by this particular library. And what the attackers did here was that they found out that it's usually, or it should be, very difficult to actually put a backdoor in the SSH service itself. So they found a library that is being kind of indirectly loaded into SSH daemon through the systemd service, which is again used on Debian and Red Hat distributions. And they found that by introducing a backdoor in this particular library, it will end up being loaded by the SSH service. So this kind of presents them with an opportunity to drop something into SSH service without backdooring the SSH service itself. Now, the backdoor itself, the library that gets loaded, turned out to be really heavily obfuscated. Again, not something that we don't see. There is a lot of malware that has quite a bit of obfuscation and can be difficult for reversing. But there are some quite interesting things that the attackers decided to do with this particular piece of code. And due to this heavy obfuscation and some dynamic protection mechanisms that they actually built in here, I guess that they were very worried about some detection in real world. So let's say that if they managed to actually push this into probably millions of servers around the world, which was their initial goal, I think they were quite worried about dynamic detection, about EDRs that we have running these days, which probably explains why they put so much effort into obfuscating their code. So we'll take a look at a couple of things that I found. As I said, there is still a lot of reversing and investigation going around this particular backdoor, and I've seen some amazing work published by a couple of persons that I'm going to reference later. We also already have honeypots that we can use for this, and there was another amazing research about how the encryption actually works on the with the payload used by the backdoor. So when we kind of open this particular backdoor, obviously, as a lot of backdoors try to do, is to kind of hook certain functions that they find particularly interesting. And with this backdoor, the goal was to allow an attacker to actually achieve remote code execution. So they didn't just try to backdoor, for example, the username password validation functions or something that validates the user client-side keys. What they try to do here is actually to achieve remote code execution, where the attacker just needed to send the initial packet to the target SSH service, which would contain very specific identification. We'll talk about that later in a few minutes, and that would allow them to execute a command on a backdoor system. Actually, some other researchers found out that there are 4 possible commands that can be carried out, but at this point in time, I think we only know about one that directly calls the system function that allows the attackers to execute something on an infected machine. So at the beginning here, what we can see is just the get CPU ID function, which gets called very, very early to dynamically modify the global offset table. And this allows the attackers to actually hook those functions. So on Windows, when we see malware hooking something, they typically hook directly the beginnings of the functions. You could do the same thing on Linux as well, but this is a little bit more stealthy. And due to the fact that they execute this code very, very early, that allows them to modify the global offset table while it's still being in read-write mode, so they can do this without perhaps a lot of detection. Now, once any reverser starts to play with new malware, we typically run the strings command to see if there are any strings that are visible or easily available in that particular binary. And that's what I did as well as one of the first things. As I was like, okay, let me see if there are some strings easily accessible here. Unfortunately, nothing was visible in this particular piece of code. Of course, it needs to work with strings, which means that they probably obfuscated those strings somehow. And again, they decided to use a very interesting way to store strings over here. A lot of malware will perhaps encrypt strings. What the attackers did here was that they used the so-called radix tree, which is one way to store strings and kind of optimize them to easily search and inject new strings. The benefit of this particular way of storing strings is that they will not be directly visible. So in order to get the strings out, we need to walk through that radix tree, and that's what they actually do when they need to look up any string in their code. So what they do here is that they will simply call a certain function, and then depending on whether a certain string exists in the radix tree, they will get back the offset of that particular string, or they don't get anything back. This allows them to look up any strings, and at the same time, you can't see them directly by just going through the code, because obviously they are stored in the radix tree format and not directly visible. You can see on this slide just a little bit about where the strings are stored as a table in the binary, and then this table, there are actually 2 tables over there. They are referenced through the code when the attackers need to actually look up something. Again, this was initially published by another researcher who managed to get all the strings out. So this allowed us to kind of see what the backdoor is interested in. Besides this, there was another interesting thing that I saw, and as I said already, the attackers tried to put quite a bit of effort into preventing both debugging and reversing or any research done on the malware. Of course, you can't prevent that completely, but you can make a researcher's life much more difficult, and that's what they obviously try to do. And as far as we can see, since it's been already about 5-6 days since this was originally published, they did a relatively good job, because we are still spending quite a bit of effort on reversing the malware and finding out what's going on over here. So here we can see one example of where they try to detect and prevent debugging. So they have a relatively simple function that will actually verify if another function has been modified, if the first instruction in that another function has been modified, which is almost always the endbreak64 function, which is actually used, 64 function, which is actually used to prevent ROP attacks. This is usually mentioned in Intel's control flow enforcement technology, something that we actually see quite often with modern CPUs as well. And the funny thing about this particular instruction is that it will work even if your CPU doesn't support this particular instruction. So this is usually present as the very first instruction in a function that's being called. And if you're using a software debugger, then what a debugger does is that it will change that instruction with the one that will cause the debugger to step through the code. And by changing the instruction, a software debugger can be relatively easily identified. So the piece of code that you can see on the slide over here, on the left side, you can see the calling function. So we can see that this particular function is being called, and in the EDX register, we can see an interesting value. And then over here, what the code does is that it actually takes the location of the NBR64 instruction. It takes the value of that particular instruction, and by doing a little bit of calculation, it verifies whether the instruction has been changed or not. So again, if you have a software debugger present, it will overwrite the instruction, and the value will not be the one that the code expects, and that indicates to the backdoor, or alerts the backdoor that there is some debugging going on, and it will simply cease its operation. So this is just one of the ways that they use to detect debugging or prevent it. There is also a lot of other things that they have in the code itself, and probably the most difficult one for analyzing is the active disassembly part, where they actually take parts of the code to calculate both their key and some of the other executing code that the backdoor ends up again executing. So they again spent a lot of effort into obfuscating the code and make it as difficult as possible for reversing. So the last thing I wanted to show here that I spent some time analyzing is part of the code where they actually parse the SSH service logs. And I found this initially quite interesting, because I noticed that, again, after we managed to figure out which strings the backdoor is dealing with, again, what we found out here was that the code will actually check for several of the log strings that are typically used by SSH. You can see the accept password for, accept public key, disconnect or connection closed by log events. So each of these are being parsed by the backdoor, and it actually extracts the usernames and IP address and port pairs from legitimate logs. At the end of this function, they actually call certain other functions with this data. So at this point in time, I'm not completely sure what they use this for, but my wild guess would be that they are trying to fake logs by actually taking legitimate logs and then overwriting certain activities that they perhaps do later. This is actually quite clever when you think about it, because in order to fake the logs, they will not put fake usernames or fake IP addresses into those logs. They will actually take real legitimate usernames or the real legitimate IP addresses and ports, and they will put that into faked logs to perhaps conceal their activities. But again, this is one part that still needs a little bit more analysis and research on, especially because due to the way that the backdoor works, since they have remote code execution, they actually end up not logging into the system. They execute their commands before they log in, but even in this procedure, they might end up producing certain logs, so they might want to kind of conceal that. So just to wrap this up, and what I showed in the last couple of slides probably took, I don't know, 15 hours of my time, if not more, but at the same time, it's quite fun. If you're a reverser, this is actually definitely something that you want to take a look at. 2 days ago, the hard-coded ED448 public key was extracted from the backdoor. Of course, this is just the public part of the key, so only the attacker has the private part of the key, and thus it will be impossible to actually replicate the full payload. The backdoor itself uses this public key with SHA-20 encryption, which is a stream cipher, to encrypt the payload. So initially, I also thought, oh, then we can replicate the payload because we know the key. Unfortunately not, because the backdoor actually takes a couple of header and command bytes, as you can see on these slides. It even takes the SHA hash of the target server's key and then signs that with the private part of this ED448 key. So this kind of prevents anyone else from abusing the same backdoor. Again, one very, very interesting design decision by the attackers. I guess they wanted to make sure that it will be only them who will be who can actually run the attack and send the payload to the target infected server. So again, quite clever and very, very interesting. I guess in next few days, we'll see a bit more information as people scramble through the code and reverse more. And every day is a very interesting day with new findings that we have around this both amazing and scary backdoor. So,
thanks, Bojan. And I think it's always fun to look at some real well-written evil, kind of. I don't want to say good evil, but it certainly fits in that category. What really amazed me is the pain that the attacker here went through to bypass some of the detection mechanisms, like you mentioned, EDR and such. I don't think any EDR has detected it, as far as I know. Of course, not given that it wasn't sort of deployed by it, we don't necessarily know. So do you think that what detection technique do you think may work for this? Any ideas, any guesses? What?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I saw that actually there is yesterday, I think one of the security companies published their scanning tool, which can detect such function hooking attempts. So which is quite advanced as well. Obviously, it's aimed against this particular backdoor. Usually EDRs, sometimes EDRs would be able to detect such witchery around hooking functions and changing, global offset tables and stuff like that. Again, it's quite difficult because sometimes you could have legitimate reasons to do that, and we don't want false positives, obviously. I don't actually think that we've seen such advanced, Linux backdoors. At least we don't see this on a daily basis. So again, shows the amount of effort that the attackers put into creating this.
Do you think there's an opportunity for network detection here, given that the attacker doesn't actually log in. They just send a command that on the network is SSH connections look different than a normal SSH connection?
So I think so, because if you remember, I mentioned that the hard-coded public key has been extracted. So even though it is only the attacker who can create the original requests, once they are sent over the network, we should be able to detect such attacks, and we can actually decrypt the payload because we know the key. We can't create our own payload, but we can decrypt it, which means that it should be possible to detect this particular attack on the network. But then again, it will cost a lot for network IDS systems because they need to perform this decryption. And to be honest, I'm not sure how worthwhile this is, because at the end of the day, the backdoor didn't make it to mainstream distributions. So I don't expect that we'll see these payloads in the real world.
Yeah, I'm just thinking for a future backdoor that uses similar techniques, or so if there is some detection that we could come up with there.
For this, very, very difficult. I saw that there was some discussion. So what they use is that they send a client-side certificate in SSH, which you can do as well. And then they use the end part of the RSA key to actually embed the payload into. So in theory, what we could do would be to see if this particular part is actually a prime number. But I think you can use some half primes and then perhaps extend them with some kind of a payload. So it's all theoretical, but definitely something that people can spend some time on. Perhaps some of the students of our STI program.
That was actually a good research project there.
Yeah, sounds like a good.
All the images that you showed are a part of your diary that you published this weekend?
Yes, I think there was one additional image, but it's all in the diary where I explain this to a bit more details. So if that's interesting to some of our listeners, take a look at the diary. And of course, if you did some research yourself, let us know and the whole world, because it's still very, very hot topic.
Yeah, it's really exciting, really interesting. So thanks a lot for all your work and spending the weekend in helping us out here with the reverse analysis.
It was fun indeed. Thanks.
Yeah, it was fun. Yeah, I remember these late night for you Slack messages.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Let's now switch off to the non-text. I think there are really two things that make this particular backdoor scary, and part of it is what Bojan talked about, the really sophisticated technical aspects of it, but there are also some non-technical, some social engineering aspects that I think can be used as a detection and prevention mechanism once you know these techniques. And that also shows some of the weaknesses sort of in our open source ecosystem here. And I'll start here with this one message. This was after the fact. Richard Jones here, who is with Red Hat, basically describes how the attacker or individuals associated with the attacker were basically lobbying Red Hat. And similar things has happened also with Debian to include this update in future releases. That, of course, was a critical part that luckily didn't quite work by the time the backdoor was discovered. And that's just where they tried to get the backdoor included into these distributions. Urgency, that's sort of really the one theme that sort of goes through so many scams, whether it's phishing or whatever, where the attacker creates some sense of urgency, trying to say, hey, act fast, drop your guard, don't do your due diligence checks and such just to get it done. This also happened against the project itself. Here's a message by an individual. Again, we don't know for sure if this individual was associated with the attacker, but they definitely helped the attacker. And that's another problem that we often see with open source projects where, well, some people are not happy with the software they got for free. And as I often say, when people aren't happy with like some of the data or so they get from Internet Storms, I always say, well, you get a refund for the money you didn't pay. But you have basically sort of patches spent years in a mailing list and aren't being approved rapidly enough. is this project still maintained? Here, another contributor to the mailing list. So these are typical complaints that come into open source projects. A maintainer is taking a break, is not necessarily following up quickly enough until stuff like this happens. Here, the maintainer, Lassie, I think you pronounce his name, is responding. And below the line here, I just said, Tan, that's the name of the individual who then committed the backdoor. Well, pointing out how helpful this individual was, and then indicating that, and that's what really happened, that this individual will be given more access and be able to help in maintaining the distribution. So some people have described this as a good cop, a bad cop routine, where you have individuals complain about the project, the changes not being made quickly enough, bugs not being fixed quickly enough, and then this white knight here jumps in, provides help, offers help. Does also make some legit contributions to the project to then convince the maintainer to give them the access they need, in this case to then include the backdoor. So just if you want to look at some of the techniques being used here, I added a couple resources where you can look at it. There's a real good write-up about the timeline, when these different messages were being sent, who the individuals were that sort of contributed these messages. And I call them different individuals because they use different aliases on these mailing lists. It's possible it was all one person, but I highly doubt it. I pretty much believe that this was a more sophisticated effort by an organization that employed multiple people here that contributed this, and at the same time they played by a playbook. They did not sort of invent that probably sort of on the fly, some of it maybe, but they had a playbook they followed to get this work done, and now we know the playbook and we can look for these indicators. And with that sort of a little bit lessons learned, a lot of people have rightfully pointed out the contribution of Michael Freund here in finding the backdoor. But I also want to point out that Lassie Collin here, the xz-utils maintainer, he's a hero as well. He maintained this particular package for years and years amid all the criticism and complaints. He maintained a super valuable package that was a target because it was so valuable. It was used by things like systemd here. So that's a big part here. And that's really what open source is sadly like. So don't be part of the problem. Don't help the attackers by bombarding repositories and maintainers with complaints. At the very least, and sure, there are stuff that doesn't work, there are bugs reports you want to file, but be nice about it. I have to say, from my own experience teaching classes, I often have absolute experts in the field in my class, and they know some of the material way better than I know it. I remember teaching our 503 class where we talk a lot about packets and tsbdump, having like the maintainer of tsbdump in the class. Those are usually the nicest people in the class. They're not the ones that point out every little mistake. They're the ones that come to you after class and give you some tips on, hey, some undocumented features and such that you can use in class later. So I think sometimes you distinguish yourself by being nice and showing actually how much you really know about a particular subject versus not being the jerk and just making fun of a simple mistake someone made and trying to prove that you're smarter that way. Just as a little sort of takeaway here, if there is an open source project that really helped you this week, some library use that saved you hours of time, leave a nice message with the maintainer. I think that's probably going to do way more to prevent future events like this than anything else we can do with better EDR and better log monitoring or whatever. But I want to close it with that, and would like to thank Bojan again, like to thank Stephen again for setting up this live feed. And thanks everyone for listening. We'll take questions also via social media channels and such as you are watching this video, either as we stream it here or later as it's being preserved and offered via YouTube and other channels. Thanks, and thanks for listening.
This is my favorite panel of the entire year. And the thing that I like most about it is you're going to hear from some industry experts to get the latest on what the attacks are all about and what we need to do to defend against it.